Alright, this is Friday afternoon. So what I've got here is I'm going to explain exactly how I've got our frames built and our jig in order to get all the lineup to match our template over here to the closest humanly possible we can do. So first I want to explain that this here is our stainless frame. As you can see, we've built this thing here to match our template. Because some of these frames or these plaques were a little off from square as far as the 24 by 36 original dimension, which is incidentally what my main frame is built to, our plaques shrunk a little bit, and when I measured the molds, some of those were a little smaller than that dimension. So we've had to custom build each one of these stainless frames to fit within the inside border of the bronze frame, not to exceed smaller than the distance we need to catch the nut location. Now this is one of our larger frames, we got more space here. So built the frame, put it together to try to maintain that as square as we can. Just want to demonstrate here that if you look here, you know, we're pretty close to square on this one. Got a little bit of a gap right there. That could just be from the chasing in the corner. I did check on this side and notice that on this side our frame's a little off. Visually, I think that's all going to work out fine as the plaque kind of covers over this. What's going to be a critical factor is how we measure to get our nuts, and I'll show you how we did that. I did check the other side over here, and this side's square. So we know that the two opposite sides are squared. This side appears to be off equally amount from that one, so we're slightly skewed. Now, knowing that the diagonals match, if we set our bolts to the inside dimension, the equal spacing, then that'll still square everything up visually as far as how the nuts oriented against our steel. So starting on the inside, what I've done on our jig, and I'll use this one for an example, we have here, I took my steel jig, took the frame, laid it on top of it, marked the holes, drilled it out, and then using the wood as a guide, I ran all thread through the wood, through the holes I drilled, and then I welded a nut on the bottom of this frame down here to the frame, locking that position in there. I then drilled the threads out of that nut so my all thread could slide up and down easily as I needed it to. I wanted the extra height there because the barrel of that nut will help us to maintain straightness and for the all thread as opposed to a shallow hole. Using a nut on both sides of the all thread allows us to be able to tighten that nut on each side, which would then help us to center this all thread and lock it in place so it's not wiggling around on us. What I've done after slipping this all thread through is I put a stainless steel nut, because we have to make sure everything we weld onto these frames is stainless steel. No carbon steel is involved other than in the tightening and on the jig. We've cut stainless steel corners to be able to weld the nut to in each one of our corners, and a stainless steel nut on the bottom of each one of our all threads with a tightening nut on it. Placing our frame leg down, and then the top frame leg down on top of it. We have squared it up. I pre-marked our frames to be top to top, which corresponds to my board. It also has the top written on it, just so I have everything uniform. I've eyeballed this ledge to get that as close as possible, looking at our edges there, which should be very close. On the inside, using a speed square, I've clearly marked an indicator. So I've measured on the inside to see where the spacing is from the inside wall to the center of the all thread and match that up. So because our frame is skewed slightly on those two corners, those two are straight, I've made sure that our distance from left to right are the same in opposite corners. Because we want this to make sure that this part is completely square on how it's going to mount to the wall, we have to make sure that the nut on the inside is equally spaced from here and on this side on the top from the back wall there. And so we have an equal space of 1 inch and 1 inch here, and an equal space of 1 inch and 1 inch there, and 3/4 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch from the side walls there and there. That ensures that where our location is right now is completely squared. So when we weld these nuts into place, when this frame is up on the wall, it'll bolt in place perfectly level. The next step, since we've got these triangles in here down in the corners, is I'm going to slide these triangles out just a tiny bit from the back wall there. The idea behind that is I need to be able to lift this triangle up after I get the nut tack down to get it into the final position, and I want just a little bit of space from that wall, about a 1/16 of an inch, to allow us not to get locked up as it travels up the welded joint there. So I'm going to adjust each one out just a tick. I've done that on these other 3 to make sure that I've got just about a 1/16 inch of space on the back side between the wall and the frame on our corner pieces. Our nuts aren't tacked into place yet. Okay. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to come around on both the front, on the top and the bottom, and I'm going to tack my steel frame to my steel frame on each one. And of course I'm using stainless steel welding rod. The idea behind that is I want to lock these 2 frames together, so once I get these nuts welded onto these plates and I take the all thread, I'll back it up now and get the stud sticking up, raising that to the height that I want to. I'll be able to slip my wooden template over the existing bolts. That'll help make sure that I've got these pins exactly straight to match up our template. Then I can take the entire unit, flip it over, reach in and weld those sections. So I'm going to go ahead now and tack each of my nuts down to that plate. Mind you, I'm only tacking the nut, I'm not welding it fully, just a quick tack to hold it to the plate in each corner. Right there. Also, I might want to add, before we tack those, like you see on this side where that nut is loose, you're going to want to run this jam nut up. This is the zinc plated jam nut. Bring that up till it touches and centers out that bolt to the bottom of that frame. Just like that. That way our bolt doesn't have any wiggle room anymore. You can see that here as well. This one's already ran up to be tight. This one's already ran up. We have just a little bit of wiggle room. We'll tighten this one up just a little bit more. Okay, so you can see that that's nice and tight. And we'll do the same thing with this one here. Okay, so these are all now snug. I didn't wrench on them, I just got them finger tight snug, so it kind of centers our bolt between that nut and that frame there on each one. That way we got a nice tight bolt on each one of these with very little movement. We're going to tighten this one up just a little bit more. There we go, just like that. All right, just like that, so it's tacked in there, doesn't have any wiggle room. Now I'm going to reach in and tack each one of those in place. Okay, so I've got each nut just tacked in place. Just mind you, I'm using a TIG welder. So we've tacked each one in its location. That secures the nut to that triangle. The triangle is not yet welded in place. Here's kind of the key point. We're going to loosen now this nut, the jam nut, and we're going to bring it all the way down till it touches our stainless nut. Just like that. Okay, that jam nut is going to be used as a spacer between the bottom of our steel and that jam nut, so we've got a nut's worth of space between the wall mount and our individual stainless nut. So I'm going to raise this up and spin this nut down. Okay, I'm going to kind of loosely tighten that in place. I'm not going to make that super tight because I want just a little bit of wiggle room because we're going to slip our wooden armature or mount over that. But you can see how that brought that up there. Well, we're going to be able to reach in and tack that when we flip it. We're going to do that on each side. Slide it up. spin our nut down, just somewhat snug, just enough that we have just a little bit of play in it. Okay. All the way down, slide it up, and then spin down our top jam nut, just like that. Okay. And then the final one over here. The nice thing about the jam nuts is when they tighten the two together around the all thread, it helps bring that to center. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is get the tacks, so that way I can make sure this frame doesn't move from my spacing right now. It's probably actually recommended you could have done these tacks, or I should have done these tacks as soon as I got my spacing correct, so I don't move this thing. So for future reference, go ahead and tack these before you do this part of the adjustment. But we'll pause it right here and I'll tack those. Alright, here you can see we've got everything in place. I've added the two small tacks. That's just to keep that steel from moving. I've done that on both sides of my frame, top and bottom. I did them on top and bottom because compared to side, because you're not going to see if there was any irregularity when you ground that off. You're not going to see them top to bottom like you could from the side, obviously. Alright, so you can see that our all thread is now sticking up high. You see where I wrote top to top, and here's the top here on my wood. Okay, and here you can see my template slipped right over my bolts that are slightly extended. These are 4-inch pieces of all thread, just for reference sake. So you can see how those are locked together. Now, since those are in and my nuts are snug, I can now lift this up, stand it on its edge, and I can reach down here and weld these up. Okay, so here we can see as I've stood the plaque up, the frames, I've got the frames tacked together. You can see my board is sitting flush, so I know that the nuts in here now are straight with my wood. That's important. You can see our stainless nut and our jam nut on how that's given us the space, so this nut isn't too close to the edge, roughly the thickness of that nut there. All right, from this point here, since we're reaching through the bottom, we can reach in with our TIG welder now and tack each corner of this triangle into place, and then we'll flip it the other side and we'll do the same thing for the top. We'll reach in and tack each one of those sections firmly in place on the corners of those triangles. Okay, so I've reached in and I've tacked each corner of that triangle plate securely in place. The nut is still tacked in place in the front. The bolts are held together, keeping everything straight. I'm going to rotate this over 180 degrees and do the other side now. Okay, I've now flipped it and I've tacked the other side in here. Because you scooted this thing out just about 1/16 of an inch, and that's got a little bit of play, as you've got this in here, this triangle will rock just a little bit. I'll give you a little tip, trick of the trade here. When you're welding these in, push the top closer to the sidewall so you get a nice clean tack here. You may lift off here a little bit more. It's a lot easier to build weld this up this way to catch into this than it is to try to build it outwards fighting gravity. You know, experienced welder can do that, but if you're not used to building things out, it's a lot easier to build up than it is to come off from the side. So push your triangle so it comes closer to touching this side to make the tack, where this side you can add more filler rod because it's easier to bind it up. As you can see, we did on both sides here. Built that up. So this plate is now tacked in place. Our stainless nut is located, our spacer's in there. At this point, I can go ahead and lay it over, pull my wood off, take a cutoff disc and zip each one of these tacks, and then undo my threads, and I'll completely de-thread all the way out of the stainless nut completely clear, leaving my jam nut down here to kind of fall loose. When I pull that out, that'll allow me to lift off this upper frame here. So that's our next step. Okay, our frame is back on its belly. Now, these are 3/8 holes. These are 3/8 pins. I ain't gonna lie, this is a little bit hard to get off. I put a putty knife in here and kind of lift up all 4 sides, and that helps me to slip that back off there, because I know the mount side is gonna have 9/16 holes, but we're having to try to keep it nice and tight, so we have to work within that 3/8 holes. So this makes sure we stay nice and tight here. So I'm gonna pry this up. It'll slip up. Once I get up off these pins, it'll come right off. Okay, so I've got our board off. Our nuts are still in place. All right. Use a 9/16 wrench for these 3/8. I'm gonna loosen this top nut just a tad. Just in case it got snug on us. Go ahead and back that out. And go ahead and back out your all thread. Because you kept everything snug and not wrench tight, that bottom jam nut will let you pull right out of it. It's still located there. We'll set our bolt off to the side. We're going to do the same thing with this one. Slide that out. Over here, I'm going to slide this out. And the last one. Slide it out. Okay, next I'm going to cut my tacks loose. So I'm going to use my nice little 6-inch Metabo grinder. Quick little cut. Remove those tacks, flip it around, do the other 2 sides, and this steel frame will be ready to lift right off of our mount frame. All right, you can see here I've reached in, cut my tacks. Our frame is loose. I can move it off to the side now. Since I didn't reference it earlier, you can kind of see what I mean, how I bore the threads out of that. All right, my jam nuts are here. Move them off the side. We don't need those now. Okay, so now we've got our corner pieces with a nut tacked in place. Spaced exactly like they need to be to match our template, and squared with our top wall here. I'm going to go ahead and run my all thread back in again. I want to make a point note that I did not bore out the centers of those. So just run those in until it stops. So you don't pressure down on it and cause that nut to kind of bend up and move since it's only tacked. The purpose of this, we're going to pick that template up and slide it back over the top here just briefly, just to make sure that those didn't move at all when we took the plaque of the frame off. Okay, so I've extended those bolts up. I ran those other jam nuts up a little bit so the board had something to rest on. And what that does is it gives me a visual space to look in here and see my nut down here. Okay? Since these are in the corners, what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully reach in with my TIG welder right here and tack the back side of that nut. That'll keep that nut from moving. That means we know we're right on with that template. So I'm going to take my plaque, my frame, reach in and tack each corner of this so this thing can't move. Okay, so reached in through this opening here. So now you can see I've got the tack I made in the front. Now I got the tack in the back. This nut is not going to move anywhere. We are dead on with where we need to be as far as our mounting holes to match the frame. So I've done that to all 4 sides here. You can see we got the front and back taps or tacks. We'll go ahead and lift our template off, since nothing is in danger of being able to move now. And now that we've got that, what we're going to want to do is to back our little all thread out. Some of these might get stuck, as mine did. So what you do is you put on another nut, back the 2 together, put a double nut on it, and you can just use the bottom nut here to get that started right back out of there. just in case it kind of swelled a little bit. So that one's clear. That one's clear. Looks like that one I'm gonna have to do a little double nut trick on this one too, because it's just a little tight in the hole. Wrenches here. Just kind of tighten them against each other and grab the bottom one. Just need a little bit of help so you don't monkey up the threads. And that one comes out. So now we can see our nuts are tacked in place, our triangles are tacked in place, and they're all equally spaced, nut distance from the top frame wall. All right, at this point you're going to want to reach in with your TIG, start in the back corner here, away from your two tack points. That keeps that triangle from being able to pull. If you started welding this way, you could actually pull this up a little bit. So if you start back here, you got a tri-point connection. This plate isn't going to be in danger of moving on you as you weld this thing out. I'll start in that back corner on each one of those nuts. Some of these plaques, this nut may be way back deep here on the sidewall. Just whatever you can get farthest back in that corner will be sufficient to hold that from moving. So I'm going to go ahead and start welding these out on each one, and I would recommend you weld a little bit, jump to another side, weld a little bit, jump to another side, and just keep bouncing around on all of these things. That way you don't endanger putting too much heat all in one pass and pulling your frame out of straight. Once we have these welded in solid, then we can flip our plaque over, our frame over, get ourselves aligned with our top again, and then we'll set the bronze plaque down on top of this and start to get that oriented, ready to clamp down. Alright, you can see my rear tack in each triangle. That triangle's not going anywhere. That nut's firmly in place. So my next step now, before I weld these out, I'm going to go around this nut and carefully weld all the way around it. This is where it's real critical that you don't get too much heat on this stainless nut, but you still get your penetration, because you don't want to melt through the nut and gall up your threads on the inside. So a nice little weld around the outside there will be sufficient. You're going to want to run your bolt back through there, make sure that that's still good and straight after you weld that all out. So I'm going to stop for a second here, weld my nuts all the way around them, make sure those are secure, and then I'll start welding the outside of the triangles, and then we'll resume filming from there. Okay, just to continue, you can see here I've got that nut fully welded around. Good penetration on that. There you go. You can see I didn't gall up any threads there, so our all thread will go in nice and clean. If I can get it started. There we go. Just like that. Okay, so I've welded each one in. Okay. And like so. So now I'm going to bounce around here welding these sides in a bit. Alright, we got corners fully welded in, jumping around. I just kind of did a little bit on each side, about a quarter inch, jumping around all four sides. Just kept spinning my frame, getting all the way around it to make sure that everything stayed, you know, somewhat cool. If you're not experienced with welding stainless steel, it has a tendency to want to pull on you really bad. So the other thing you can do is put a clamp, you know, maybe a piece of iron across here, and a clamp pulling down that iron to help keep this frame clamped down while you bounce around and hit these. If you take your time, this won't get pulled out of frame. Okay, I flipped the frame over. We're on the ground now. You can see we've still relatively flat against our steel table. Just want to ensure this sits relatively flat against our stone upon installation. Looks like we're popped up just a little bit, but we can pull that down with the clamp and we get to weld the plaque on there. Okay, at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this to a smaller table that's not quite as wide, so I can work a clamp on both sides, and we'll get ready to start putting the bronze plaque on there. Okay, here we're our frame transferred over to our smaller metal cart. So, knowing that I've got this marked as the top and everything's squared in, I'm going to lay the bronze on top of here and square it up on this frame, trying to get this top edge even with this part here, and just kind of checking around all sides to make sure it sits on here nice and balanced and level.